Do you want to introduce us?
Yes.
This is such a treat for us because we've known each other for some years and we have a huge respect for the way each other's work. But we also feel drawn towards the particular philosophies that we work in. So it's lovely, and we call it a conversation in learning between friends. Friedrich Froebel, I've got a picture of him here, and you can see that he's not contemporary. His mother died when he was nearly a year. His father was a very strict, very rigid pastor in Thuringia, in what was formerly East Germany. And he married again very quickly, within a year, and at first his new wife was fond of this little baby, but as soon as she had her own child, she more or less rejected Froebel. So he spent a lot of time in the garden. So nature is a huge theme. He later became a forester. He also loved the patterns in nature, and at university he studied mathematics. He became curator of the museum in Berlin and was a crystallographer, which was cutting-edge science in those days, chemistry. And he became a tutor in a family working with children when he realised he thought education was so important. And he founded the first primary school. It went through sort of for older children as well in Keilhau. And that was started because his brother he died and his children were orphaned. So he started the school with them, and local children came. He began to realise that the little children were hugely important. He invented kindergarten, 1837, and in Blankenberg you can still go and visit his kindergarten school, which is now a fabulous museum. And he kept going back because he realised babies were important, family was so important to him, having lost his mother so young. And for him, the way that we cuddle babies, the way that we sing with babies, that feeling of nurture and security that children need. And he made what he called the mother songs, but actually they were family songs. So grandma, older brothers and sisters, everybody would sing these songs. So that, in a nutshell, is some of the key things about Froebel. He believed in the importance of play, and that's absolutely huge. He actually brought play into education. So he's a real pioneer.
Rudolf Steiner was quite an extraordinary man. When he was born to a father who worked on the railways, and in what it's now Croatia. It was Hungary in those days. And he was intensely aware of nature. He loved to be outdoors as much as he possibly could, and he was intensely awake to nature and also to the reality of an inner life. And he felt that we all had more within us that we could bring to almost everything. He gave so many lectures on so many different subjects, and what's interesting is education is only one strand of it. It's also biodynamic agriculture, special needs, which are the camper communities, medicine, anthroposophic medicine, which is, I don't know if you've heard of Walida, pharmaceutical, yeah. And so on, just lots and lots of different things, architecture, art, painting, drawing, movement. It just went on. And every time somebody came to him and said, what about architecture? He would start on a lecture about architecture and where it could go. Quite extraordinary. One day, a man heard him lecture to the workers of his factory, And this factory was the Waldorf Astoria cigarette factory in Stuttgart. And he asked if Steiner could give a series of lectures to the teachers and to the workers of the factory. And eventually out of this, it started the first Waldorf school, which opened in 1919. So 100 years old this year. This school was imbued with his ideas on child development, which were quite groundbreaking at the time. But the kindergarten, which is what we call our early childhood settings, got its name from Froebel as a child's garden or a paradise garden. And that's how we see it, as a garden of paradise where children can be. And we see childhood from birth to 7. And I think this is one of the things that mixed age groups, very important, where children can learn from each other and can grow up together. So really, Steiner's educational ideas were that we must educate the whole child. And that is, it's called a holistic education, the education of the head, the hand and the heart. Thinking, doing and feeling. And that if we address all three in equal measure and at the right time, that will be a truly creative education, which addresses the whole human being. And that's really what lies behind the education. It is very fast growing. We've got about 1,200 all through schools and about 3,000 kindergartens now in over 64 countries around the world, and it's growing incredibly fast. It is in this country a private school system, but not in the rest of the world. The most important thing, he said, was for the adult who is with the children to be worthy of imitation by the child. And that means in our thinking, in our feeling, in our speech, in our gesture, in our everything we do needs to be worthy of imitation for the child. That's a hard ask for anybody.
Montessori was born in 1870. She was born in Italy, and she was one of the first women to train as a doctor. And that kind of scientific background has certainly marked her approach to working with children, and it has determined the development of the whole pedagogy. She, like Steiner and Froebel, believed passionately in the power of the child and what the child can bring to the world. She certainly saw children to be agents of change, and she campaigned for early years education to be more important than university, because she recognized that the start of the child will be so phenomenally important to how the child develops, that we needed to pay a great deal of attention to how children are educated. But because she started her life as a doctor, she worked with children with special educational needs initially, and she learned from them that they love to do things, they need to engage their hands. So this idea that active learning is very much at the heart of Montessori education is one of the principles which we follow to this day. But as a young doctor, she also fallen in love and had a child, but decided not to marry, which at the end of the 19th century in Catholic Italy was a phenomenal decision to make, but the only one which would survive her profession. And as a result of giving up her child, she writes really inspirationally about the child, but also she has a very romantic view of the child. But everything that she writes is really for us to be in the service of children with whom we work. Unlike what Montessori education is today, where it is fundamentally providing education for the parents who can afford it, in Montessori's day, it was for the children who didn't have. And she was very committed to working with women. She campaigned for women's rights, and later on in her life she campaigned for education for peace. She felt that it was the child who held the promise of the future, and if we only could educate children in a way that they would value human life, they would be respectful to the environment, the world would be a very different place. She believed passionately that the world without war is in the hands of educators, not in the hands of politicians. And that has continued to be mission of Montessori educators to this day, and she has certainly borrowed many of the ideas from Froebel, including his ideas about education about the universe, the child being part of the cosmos, seeing the child as being part of the interdependence of the whole world, and as such also being an agent of change. She also was evolutionist. So she believed that nothing stood still, but everything changed all the time, which is a fantastic tool for an educator, because we can learn from the children and about them as we travel through the journey of life with them. She spent most of her life traveling the world, and as a result, like Steiner and Froebel, Montessori education is an international movement. There are lots and lots of schools around the world, and they are not only the children's houses, but also primary. And at the moment, there is a very, very strong movement in parts of Europe and in the United States to develop Montessori secondary education to enable young children, or young people in fact, to have a strong voice for change of society.
Froebel was a crystallographer. He also loved nature. His favourite tree was actually the linden tree, and so we've got an autumnal bit of linden tree here. And he wanted his materials to be natural, and again that's something where we're all very much in agreement, which is why we said we would look at wooden blocks. The first gift that Froebel thought of was the soft sphere. He didn't stipulate size, so they can be any size, and he realised that babies love to have things which they can bobble about, or you could just have them loose. And he put them in the colours of the rainbow. I think they're in the colours of the rainbow under here, but he wasn't rigid about it. One of the things that he realised as he moved on in his work was that it's terribly important to observe children, that you should observe children, watch what they're doing, and then respond in the light of that. So it's like a sort of conversation with the child. Try to support them in the educationally worthwhile things that they are trying to do. And he also believed that if they were doing something that was unacceptable, that you should try to find the reason behind that, because there will always be a reason. And then you would work with that. And I think that's another area where we're very, very agreed. We don't do punishment or golden stars or golden times or any of those sorts of things. Again, he didn't really stipulate ages because he was very focused on family. So although this sort of thing appeals to babies, actually adults like them too. And playing with a soft sphere is a very enjoyable thing to do even when you're an adult. So age didn't come into it, but they would certainly be particularly attractive to babies. He believed in the law of opposites because he always wanted to make people think. So got the soft sphere, but then he introduces the hard sphere. It's hard, it's solid, and it's a completely different experience. And his second gift he actually designed a little bit later on, because he then moved into cubes, and that's this one. So making things with the cubes, and he had 8 cubes in a hollow box, and you would give them to children. You do like doing sandcastles. You'd put the box down like this, and then you would take the lid out, and you'd get your sandcastle. So that was something that children would enjoy. So the second gift has got the cube it's got the sphere, but he also believed very deeply everything links. Everything in the universe links. And he would say link, always link. So the sphere is rounded, but the cube is not. So opposites. But the cylinder has circles on it. It has rounded surfaces, but it's also, like the cube, got flat bits, but it doesn't have angles. But if you start spinning all these things, you begin to see different things in the air. So it's quite fun. I won't do it now, but you're welcome to come and have a go. The next gift was a contrast again, what we call the planks. Gift 5, he introduces prisms. I should probably make the whole thing fall down when I do this, but little prisms. He believed very much in introducing children, so that they're in a three-dimensional world. So the blocks are part of a three-dimensional world. Terribly important. And the way to teach shapes is not to go flat. And then this is a different sort of mix with gift 6. And I haven't got time to move on with the gifts, but those were what he called the gifts. When you come to the occupations, you go flat. So you start having things like parquetry, stick laying, loads of different occupations. And so the one that we picked out between, because it seemed to fit for all of us, was to look at weaving as an example. So you go from solid shapes to flat shapes, stick laying, and then you start to get sticks that wiggle about, and that's what happens when you do weaving. So law of opposites, straight sticks, wiggly ones, and you can do sewing and all sorts of things. So there's a tremendous logic in it. We lost a lot of this because, unlike the Steiner and Montessori movements, who kept very close to their roots, but as you said, not so much in the mainstream in the UK context, we got very, very mainstreamed and lost a lot of our treasure. So we've been working very hard in the last decade. We're putting back a lot of these things, and we all believe in training, don't we? So we all do lots of training so that people can stay close to the roots but operate very effectively in the world of today. So that's just a tiny taste of the Froebelian gifts and how they move into the occupations.
Montessori went back to university and she studied educational anthropology, and that's the time when she has come across the work of Froebel, who significantly influenced some of the designs of the early years materials that she has shared with children. And so she has not only borrowed from Froebel the love of the environment and the dedication to the universe and everything universal, the fact that we are in fact are part of a cosmos rather than just part of a specific country, but she also recognized the importance of introducing the opposites to the children. So we would begin by teaching children the primary colors before we would do secondary colors and shades, and also working with the solid shapes long before we begin to work with flat shapes. And that was the beginning to our geometric solids. So there is a documented thread between Froebel and Montessori in her developing the geometric solids inspired by the gifts. And the initial set of the solids would be just a collection of solids which the child would explore their properties. Do they roll? Do they twist? Do they stand? How do they fit together? But Montessori was really fascinated in the way how children learned, and she developed a way of scaffolding the children's learning in small, manageable steps. So the initial exploration with the solids, which in itself is incredibly meaningful and important start for the child, would then move potentially for the solids to be paired up with flat bases. And by matching the facets of the solids to the bases provides the child with a foundation for naming of the solids at a later stage. So indirectly, the child already is aware of the fact that this is a square-based prism because it is made of squares and rectangles. So in this relationship between the bases and the solids, the child is prepared for the naming of later study of geometry. But her ideas of exploring the shapes further leads us to the binomial and trinomial cube. And I must tell you, Tina, that for the first time today I have understood why the binomial cube that I learned to use had exactly the same lid as your box. And I was always wondering, why are they making it so difficult for the children to open the box? And as you can see, the manufacturers now have put hinges on it. But imagine the magic when you slide the lid from under and suddenly the cube emerges. So sometimes by making things easier for children, we actually make it much, much more difficult. So what happens with the cubes is that initially the children play with them, they build with them, they can compare and group the ones that are the same or that are similar, they can group by color, they can group by shape. But eventually, each one of the pieces will have its own name. Each one piece can have a label. And if you labeled each piece and removed the pieces, you would have the binomial or trinomial formula left written on the paper. And that is really an excellent example of how Montessori was fascinated with the way how to guide children's learning through small, manageable steps towards a really logical structure within the brain. She really wanted to understand how children learn and support their learning. To some extent, she kind of resonated with the guided learning ideas that we shared with Cassie this morning. The only difference is that for Montessorians, the guided learning is the beginning, a foundation for the child, so that the child can use then the knowledge whichever way they need to do. So spontaneous learning based on some kind of logical foundation is at the heart of the Montessori pedagogy. An example of kind of more guided construction is the Roman arch, where the children can actually build the arch, and lo and behold, they will be surprised when you remove the middle. It stands, it doesn't collapse. A little bit of magic.
Steiner didn't give any direct indication on the sort of toys that we use, other than to say that whatever happens, they need to be meaningful, they need to be beautiful, they need to feel good in your hands, and they need to come from nature, if possible. Also that they can be made yourself. And whatever the children were given to play with, or are given, or are provided in a Steiner kindergarten, is open to be played with in many, many different ways. It needs imagination, it needs creativity, it needs spontaneous, something that just comes from nothing. So something like this could be a pine cone, could be a tree, it could be a biscuit, it could be anything the children want it to be. Our blocks, the children would saw, then they might sand them, then we would oil them, and we would make our own sets of blocks. The nice thing about using wood is if it breaks, you can mend it. 9 times out of 10, not always. But they need to see that things can be mended, can be reused. We can get things from nature, that we don't have to produce something to play with. The other thing is they're open-ended. They need creativity and imagination for their use. So what happens is this, or even a round one, could be a wheel, a steering wheel. Or, if you have a look at this picture up here, they've used them for the wheels on the removal lorry. Whatever happens, it's to be used in the child's own spontaneous way. They can be built with. The children in my kindergarten many years ago, we made these blocks to be used. Over 30 years old, some of these. and they're still good. They can be used for anything the children want them to be. And that goes with all the toys and playthings that we use. We use natural logs that we've gone and found in the forest, and we've cleaned up and washed and scrubbed and then maybe oiled so that they last. And they can be used here as a little house, or a shed for the donkey, or the train track, and we could have lots of these. This train was made in my kindergarten by one of the children. They've just cut up the logs, and this took a while, and that's something that's very exciting for them. It took something like 6 months for this little boy to make,
exactly.
I think. But he measured each one of these, and he looked at it very carefully, and then he wanted to make a little man out of a peg, and so on. So he really, really, he thought the whole thing through, his little train. And here it has a little track to run on. So everything that we have needs to be open to imagination, needs to inspire creativity. We also say it needs to be good, beautiful, and true. So nice to touch, nice to feel, based in real experiences that the child can really understand. Unformed and open-ended. They play with things like this in so many different ways. So unlike the Montessori, where there's fairly specific ways of putting things together, we say, here's a big basket full of logs, and there's a big basket of cloths, and a big basket of pine cones. And then we have free play time. And that's where the children can do anything they want with anything they find. So it's a nurturing environment which is provided, but it's totally open to the child's own imagination, how they want to use it. And, it's just wonderful. I haven't brought a shell today, I should have, but I saw in a kindergarten the children were playing shops, and they were selling various things. They had biscuits and they had cakes, and these were the trays that they were taking them around on. Oh, perfect. Look, I've got it from both. Thank you, Tina. And they had a till, and they were swiping their credit card. Beep, beep. Yeah. So it can be anything the child wants it to be, and I think that's the magic of what we do with the children.
So from the Montessori perspective, we also pay huge attention to the child having real experiences. From very young, the children will be using plates and glasses for their snack. They will not use plastic, they will use china and real glass, because we felt it was really important to give them real experience. And so, as happened in most nursery schools, the children always have a need to mirror what is happening at home. And the story of the nursery school teacher is that at least one new baby arrives to the family during the academic year. Usually it's more, as you probably know, but if there is a new baby, we would provide opportunities for occupation. We talk about the occupations from Froebel's point of view. We also would encourage children to introduce some of the ideas, such as threading first, threading beads and using the skill of threading, then to introduce sewing using a proper needle. Initially, the sewing will be relatively short so that the child does not have to manage a long thread to wind. And we will begin to introduce weaving, where we will use different color paper to enable the child to start doing weaving. And it could develop into weaving on metal frames. And because this would be easily done in the outside, we could keep it hanging on the fence, and the children could add to it. So from an individual piece of work like this sewing, we could then gradually move towards cooperative effort, because different children could have contributed to this. And of course, in the garden, it would have been on much larger scale. What is interesting in Montessori's writing, that initially in her first writing, she really did not approve of weaving. she said something very negative. And then her time in India and her encounter with Gandhi suddenly made weaving to become a magic. So in the rewrite of her first book, she talks very positively about weaving, and so weaving has come into the Montessori environment after the Second World War.
Froebel wanted children to be self-aware, but he also wanted them to be part of their community. He saw that sort of childhood as the way that we would help children to have the things that are necessary in order to be an adult who can contribute to their community and society. This is a little piece of weaving that a 7-year-old made, inspired by seeing lovely rugs and things. Again, we might have a piece of fencing outside, and again, you know, we would be weaving things. We might weave plants too. The sort of things that tend to happen, particularly sort of rather seasonal things, is children made these from willow pattern, and they were terribly thrilled at being able, this is rather lovely early effort, and it comes unravelled quite quickly. But, you know, weaving bits of ivy and all sorts of things into that, hanging them up in places. And then, as Barbara said, it would link in very closely with almost with the sewing. So the binker, and then having bits of material and just doing stitches, making things for the doll's house, all the small world play, because people love to have carpets and things, and you know, perhaps learning to do it a little bit more formally if they like to do that. So it hasn't got a terrific order in it. It's really about relating to things that you see adults doing and finding ways to help children become involved with wiggly lines in lots of different ways, because the idea is to be creative and to use the real world as a way of accessing alternative, more abstract worlds. So you make your own designs when you do the weaving.
What we say is that because children learn out of imitation of the adult, if they see us sewing, they will want to sew, so we would have a basket with us and they can begin to make their own things. And just in the way that we work with everything that we do, very deliberate, very clear, very obvious in the way that we are handling the tools, the children will learn to do them in the right way out of imitation, we hope. A little bit of help now and then might be necessary, but mostly out of imitation. They will end up making their own dolls to play with, and their dolls' blankets, for instance. If they're going to sew, it needs to be something that is meaningful. So we don't sew to practice sewing, we sew because we need dolls for the kindergarten, or we need, if we're going to weave, it's because we need placemats. So what we also work with are processes, and for children to see where something comes from and to have experience of what it can become in different formats is very important. And again, we try and find things from nature. So we wouldn't have a tool to use, we would find a stick like this, thread some thread on it, and the children could weave the wool that they have made. Later on, when they're a little bit older, they will make their own weaving looms, perhaps, and something like this, where they cut, measure the sticks, sand them, drill the holes, everything that they do, they will make sure that it all fits, and then they will start to weave. And they would end up by threading it themselves and learning how to weave. This is more an older child activity. But they're weaving it because it would have an end result. So at the end of their time, it could become a cloth to put a vase on at home on the table, or a blanket for the dolly. So whatever it is, it would have a purpose. Always everything has an end purpose, and the end purpose enhances ourselves, each other, or the environment. Everything has a purpose, and everything has a process. So for instance, if we were going to do weaving or felting, we would first find a sheepskin, then we would wash it. I don't know if you can see it in this picture over here. with the children, and then we would dry it, hang it up, or dye it first with plant dyes, and then we would actually make something from it.
Return to the theme of the dolls and the fact that in most nurseries there will be babies arriving in the family, and as Janni said, young children like to imitate what the adults do. So most older sibling has a desperate need to bath the baby. Of course, a rather precarious activity with the real creature. So we would set up a practical activity in the nursery, ready with the bath and the water, the soap, and of course a little dolly that could be properly wrapped up and cared for and really looked after in a similar way to the way in which the baby would be looked after at home. Ideally, you would have had a big bath and you would have had a doll of life size. Unfortunately, my 2.5-year-old granddaughter would not relinquish her Ronan for one day to share with you. So I have had to source a doll commercially from Amazon. I must tell you, this has been a rather trying experience. Most of the dollies looked horrible. They were not very inviting. To get a gentle, neutral bath was impossible. So the only real little thing that came and is genuine is this little bar of soap that came from a hotel. But I think from the child's point of view, soaping the baby, wiping it, rinsing it and wrapping it in a blanket requires a huge amount of care, attention, and enables the older sibling to really share some of the empathy as well as frustration with the sibling. I have seen some very rough handling which a live baby would not have survived, but it served purpose. So these real life experiences in the nursery are a very important element of everything that the children are learning, and we will, like with the Steiner education, we will teach them skills so that they would become competent in using proper knives, using carpentry tools, using the real needle from very early on, because we give the children respect and we give them trust in believing that if we respect them, they will use their tools appropriately and in the way how they have been shown. And I have certainly witnessed that many, many times.
Hello, little one. How are you today? Oh, have you got cold feet? Oh dear, maybe we better cover them with a blanket. It's been very cold here today, hasn't it? Ah, well. Did you want to go and play with your friend? Oh, look, she's sleeping. I don't think we'd better wake her. Maybe we could sing a little song to her. Rock-a-bye baby on the treetop. All of these things are really working out of imitation. This is how we would love them to be with babies, with dolls. We would love them to care for them. It really hurts if you see somebody going, especially, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do that. It's all right, you don't cry now. But when you treat a doll or a baby like that, somehow you change the image of how we deal with each other, of how we are with each other. We really take care. And we use dolls, I wouldn't say to demonstrate this, because we don't. We do it because we actually care for the dolls. And if we really care for the dolls, the children will too. So unfortunately, we can't bath them.
No, absolutely.
Because they're all very soft. They're all quite unformed and extremely cuddly. And they have features. I was told that this one did have a little mouth, but it was kissed so often that the mouth actually came off. But we also use our dolls as puppets, and they can be played with by the children or by us, and they can do all sorts of different things. We make them as well in front of the children, or we make them with the children. These are out of pegs, and they're very simple to make, and they really work very, very well. We knit or felt our little animals, and again, we can do this in front of the children, and then they play with them. When we tell stories, which we do every day, each day, repeated from the heart, when we tell stories, we might end by doing a puppet show. So after telling the same story for around a week, we would do a puppet show of that story. And when we start doing the puppet shows, it again stimulates the children to do it as well. And they would do this sort of thing, or they would make a scene like this. I had a wonderful picture of it. Here we are, this little boy over here. He'd set up a puppet show similar to the one that we'd been telling, and he was doing it, well, he was just setting it up because it's what he wanted to do. And he wasn't actually telling the stories at all, but within 10 minutes of him starting to set it up, the children had put the chairs out, and they were sitting there, with sometimes some of them with their babies, waiting for him to tell the story. And and then some of them went and helped him, and they would all tell the story together. But actually the setting up was more fun than the storytelling in the end. So it's a really lively way of providing things for the children to play with, and for them to learn how to take care out of imitation of ourselves, and also to recreate what they might see at home or around them with children. One November, I did find the dolls on a big pile of sticks in the middle of a floor. And it was obvious they were playing Guy Fawkes, but those babies were rescued and put back in their beds before they could be burned. So they do play out what they see around them, and really what we have to do as adults is to help to transform this as much as we can.
For Froebel, he believed very much that children need rich first-hand experiences of real life. He talks about the forms of life, everyday life, the form of beauty. He wanted children to appreciate the beauty and patterns in the things that they were experiencing. And he did want them to gain real knowledge. So as a mathematician or a crystallographer, a scientist, natural sciences, literature and music, all the arts were all very important to him. He wanted children to have knowledge. But he wanted to approach this through freedom with guidance, and that feels very strongly important. The adult needed to be highly able to observe what children were doing so that children can make the connections. He did think that children needed to be allowed to explore good and evil. They were the stuff of drama. But he would want the adult to help them to develop a moral framework so that they could contribute in a positive way to the world, to society. He believed children could make good futures for humanity. So dolls are a very important part of this. On the whole, the children choose the names, and you can see the dolls will come from anywhere in the world. They might be linked with bits of literature, and the adult will set up a little scenario after telling a story so that children can play out the story. Stories do change too. I mean, they don't necessarily do it according exactly to how the text went. Children might find things like the salt and pepper pots that happen to be two owls and decide that they ought to have clothes and start creating whole stories about them. Or they might have seen the garden gnome in a garden. People do have gnomes in their gardens. And they've decided, that they would like Orsino to become a character, and they take him into the garden and they play in the garden with him. Dolls' houses are important, but so is the making of dolls. So these are dolls which the adult has made for the children to play with, but children start making their own dolls, and they might well put a face on that or a hat. They begin to go from the literal to the more abstract, imaginative world. I think a recent definition of imagination is the rearrangement of past experience in new and fascinating ways. So Peter McKellar is really almost stating a Froebelian view of how the imagination evolves. So here you've got a child who loves dancing, dressing up in ballet clothes and that sort of thing, desperate for the doll to have pointy shoes like a ballerina and be able to stand on tiptoe. So her father made that doll for her. So it's about the adult tuning in to the children's stories, the children's imagination, and helping them to develop that. But just as Froebel starts with the whole, with the gifts, at the end of the day, the dolls need to go back into their beds or sit on their chairs or wherever they should go at the table. They need completion. So there's a wholeness about it. You start with the whole and then you go back to the whole. So it's whole to parts. And that's a very important part of his concept of unity. And it applies to everything that we do.
If you all had to describe the differences or the unique things about your approach in one sentence, which I realise is a ridiculous question.
It's impossible, and we think we've been showing the differences as we've gone through. So, you can see we do love each other a lot, and we've got enormous respect for each other, but there are differences, and hopefully they emerge, but it is quite subtle, you're right.
And I think if you went to visit a Montessori nursery, there wouldn't be this delicious abundance of things. It would be much more organized. It would be much more, each thing would have its own little place. Sense of order is of paramount importance to us because we want to give the children freedom to choose, and really the idea of spontaneous learning is very much at the heart of Montessori education. So the role of the adults, it's really interesting that we have got the principles of how we see the child are absolutely the same. I can definitely say that we all feel for the child in the same way, but how we prepare the learning for them will be different, and that's what makes the difference in the pedagogies, and that's what has made opportunity for Montessori to learn from Froebel and for Steiner to employ the principles that he believed in their approach.
I think for us the biggest difference really is the emphasis on free, imaginative, child-led play, where we provide an enabling environment where the children can make of it what they wish, and that they need to play out what it is that they're experiencing in life.
But we would be adding in the sort of mathematical possibilities perhaps a little bit more, because we've got these slightly different approach with the, but then children might be finding things as well. So
our maths would come out of baking.
Yes.
Weighing.
So it's there.
Yeah,
I mean
it's daily life activities.
Yes.
We do maths all the time.
And we do that in the occupations.
I wanted to ask whether there's a connection, or what the connection might be, between your approaches and the Reggio Emilia approach.
Well, it's just like another pedagogy that has grown out of the pioneers. Certainly the attention to the environment, I always ascribe to Montessori. The focus on the spontaneous play that comes from the child, guided by the adults, has got the roots in Froebel and some of the Steiner, and they have got their own unique way how they see light and how they explore those things with children. But I think that where they are skilled is the articulation of the children's learning. Yes? Yeah. So they interpret it in a way that all of us can share in it, and all of us admire how they tease out the learning from what the child does. So it may look kind of effortless, but it requires a huge amount of skill and a huge amount of time to be able to talk.
I am working on a new early years gallery, and I've been looking at, various approaches to education. But one thing that I really struggle with is when I'm looking at these educational approaches that are used in nursery and kindergarten environments where children know each other and where they grow a very strong relationship with their teachers and their community. That is different than coming into the museum for an hour or two and enjoying an activity and then leaving and maybe coming back regularly, but it's still different. You're in a space with maybe hundreds of strangers and a new novel environment. And so I guess one of my questions is how can we employ some of the philosophies and the approaches of this, but with the understanding that our environment is different, and what would you suggest?
This morning, when we had the panel that Gina was chairing, I thought it was so fascinating to hear about the street play project and how Diana had really stressed the importance of the adults in the T-shirt so that people feel secure, they know that there's somebody there who's going to be helping them, so that families can relax, and that because parents are always so worried about their children's behaviour, what the parent needs to feel is that you like the child, because that's what parents are worried about. Will you like my child? Because they might behave badly. So if that can be relaxed, and if the person in the T-shirt can join the parent, and together you look at what the child is doing and you articulate it together, so that you draw out what a Froebelian would call the educational worthwhileness, but the thing that's imaginative, creative, wonderful the child is doing, that relaxes parents, because the child isn't coming on their own, they're coming with their family. And so if the family can come and enjoy themselves together and they relax, then the children will get a lot more out of it. And so will you, as the person in the museum offering it, because you'll see. So I don't think it matters that it's not a classroom. It's a different way of people coming together. I'm so sorry, Janni.
No. I mean, there were two things actually that I was struck by today. One was the outside environment, and I was thinking about the Museum of Childhood with that lovely space strip down the side, and thinking, gosh, just a few planks and some tyres. What a difference that would make there with somebody to, just stop it getting a little bit out of hand, when you've got tyres up to here and a child climbs on the top. But there's so much potential. But when I was in there and I was looking at the puppet exhibition, it broke my heart because it just was so static. And I thought, if there was somebody who was near there, who had a puppet, whether it was a marionette or a puppet, and who would say, did you see that puppet in there? Come and have a look. What can you see? There's a Punchinello. Yes, he's that one. Yeah, and you begin to interact and see, but I'm talking to the puppet. The puppet's talking to me. Yeah, we're not interacting with the children, but the children will come, I can tell you. They will just be drawn to it. and and then next to it there's something with puppets, and they can play with it. So they can play out. It brings it alive. It brings exhibits alive, but it needs some adult starting things off, and that takes imagination.
I also think that in early years you need to have lots of resources, that are durable, so that if one wants, somebody else can come and have the same.
Yeah.
I think that is really, really important, because the children don't know each other. So encouraging them to share doesn't really make very much sense in that context.
I wondered if you could comment on gender and play forms, and in your experience, is it difficult to encourage little boys to play with dolls and care for dolls, and if so, why?
We have got a colleague who runs a Facebook page called Male Montessorian, and he is exploring some really interesting issues about gender and what it all means, giving some real challenges to, for example, me as a practitioner who has been doing things for a long time. He has engaged me in different ways, thinking about it, and really what is the role of men and women in the settings and all that kind of thing. So please look at it, because I'm sure you will find something interesting there.
Little boys take very much to small world play, and it very often you're creating town scenes, or in their dressing up clothes, they will create characters. And one of my Froebelian colleagues, Penny Holland, has done a lot of work on this, where she joins the children. They're not allowed to have guns or things, but they can make their own. And what she finds, and it's very much in Froebel's writing, is that children, when they explore things that are evil, don't become evil. They are exploring what it is to be evil, and it helps them to reject things that are evil. So I wouldn't want to typecast boys in that role, because actually girls do also join in with it. But the more you can understand things which are deeply wrong and antisocial and all those sorts of things, that comes into the play, and it does come into doll play.
Boys love to build. They like to build and look at this, he was moving house. One of them had moved house, and he was moving house. They love big building, active, but it doesn't mean they're not going to play with the dolls, because actually the dolls go with them. They're the children often, and they go with them. They sit in the back, in the car that they've built or whatever it is, or in the home. When they're playing in the home corner, they will be playing with the dolls. Yeah. And we have as many boy dolls as we have girl dolls, and they play with them just as happily, because they are enacting what they see in life.
Froebel was a crystallographer, Steiner was a scientist, Montessori was influenced by modern current thinkers of the time. Do you think that all these three approaches are a little bit romanticised, a bit historical, possibly a little bit out of date? Is it time, a little bit feminised maybe, is it time for some new thinking, quantum entanglement, postmodern theories, to be brought into this, or not?
What I find useful about Froebel is going back to the roots makes me think about the things which are really important. And I certainly wouldn't be a Froebelian if I felt that it wasn't equipping children for an incredibly changing future, where they need inner resources. Froebel talked about making the inner outer and the outer inner. We've all talked about the universe and the cosmos. So I would say that they're in many ways at the forefront of what is needed for childhood today, if we're going to survive into the future.
Absolutely, and I think things like enabling free child-led creative play is one of the most important things we can do. And it was so interesting, because I wrote down some of the key words that I saw today, this morning: flexible, confident, social, empathetic, joyful, resilient, creative, having perseverance, adaptable, imaginative. I think, this is what we give children. And if we start off with these first 7 years as seeing this as the vital part of embedding these skills, yeah, it just goes on. I believe so, anyway.
But I don't actually think there is any harm at looking at these three approaches from the postmodern perspective. What does it really mean to children? Not to us as academics and people who develop theory. What is the experience like for children? And the fact that the three approaches still continue to thrive means that they are offering something to children and their families.
Thank